The bowl hit the ground with a sharp crack, and the sound echoed through the house like a confession no one could take back. Dirty water spilled across the kitchen tiles, running under the legs of the chair where Nora Alridge sat, too stunned to move. Her trembling hands clutched the edge of her shawl as the woman she had welcomed into her home, her son's wife, stood above her with eyes full of disdain. From the hallway, a man watched, silent, breath caught halfway between heartbreak and disbelief. He had built empires, signed deals that shaped cities, and faced down oil tycoons twice his size. But nothing had ever felt like this. That man was Brenton Alridge, one of Oklahoma's quiet billionaires. A man who had everything except peace. And what he was about to do next would silence everyone who thought power was about money. Before we begin, please like, subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. Brenton Alridge had never been born into wealth. His childhood had been spent in the plains outside of Tulsa, surrounded by dry fields and the hum of oil rigs in the distance. His father had worked those rigs until his hands turned leather rough, and when he passed unexpectedly, it was Nora, Brenton's mother, who held their little family together. She worked night shifts at a local diner for 20 years, scraping by so her son could study business at the University of Oklahoma. Brenton never forgot that. Not even when he made his first million. Not even when that million became hundreds. By 42, he was known as the man who'd revived 3 oil service companies on the brink of bankruptcy. His name carried weight, but his heart stayed rooted in the dirt of his beginnings. He wasn't the type of man who wore pride loudly. He kept his success private, his circle small, and his life simple. And then came Delaney Quinn, a woman who walked into his life like a polished mirror, reflecting everything he thought he wanted. She was beautiful, composed, and spoke in the soft cadence of confidence. She came from a family known for its old Tulsa money, people who believed class could never be bought. Yet, Delaney was the kind of woman who made anyone believe she could bridge any world. At first, she seemed genuinely interested in Brenton's grounded ways. She said she admired his humility, the way he still visited his mother's small home in North Peoria every Sunday. He believed her. But time has a way of showing people for who they really are, and some masks only slip when they're tested. When Nora's health began to decline, Brenton did what any son raised on respect would do. He brought his mother to live with them. The Alridge estate, a wide ranch-style home built on the outskirts of Tulsa, had more than enough space. To Brenton it made sense. But to Delaney, it was an intrusion. It started with small things. The subtle tension in her smile whenever Nora thanked her for something. The way she forgot to invite Nora to dinner with their friends. The way she rolled her eyes when Brenton mentioned his mother's advice. Delaney had mastered the art of pretending, not to love, but to tolerate. To outsiders, she was the perfect wife of a man who'd built a fortune through grit. To those who lived inside that home, her charm began to feel like glass, beautiful, cold, and ready to shatter. Brenton didn't notice it at first. He was too busy juggling contracts, acquisitions, and quiet boardroom battles. Delaney knew how to play that space well. She hosted charity luncheons, smiled for photos, and whispered sweet reassurance into Brenton's ear about how much she supported his decisions. But behind that calm exterior was a woman who couldn't stand the sight of humility. To her, Nora's presence was a reminder that Brenton came from what she called the working class. When Brenton wasn't home, Delaney's tone shifted. Her patience evaporated. Nora's soft voice, her slow steps, her need for help, all of it grated on Delaney's nerves. She began to sigh loudly whenever Nora asked for assistance. She left her meals on the counter cold. And sometimes, when no one was around, she let her contempt show in full. Nora said nothing. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the quiet wisdom of an older woman who knew that exposing cruelty often backfires. She simply prayed for peace in her son's marriage. But peace isn't built on silence. It's built on truth, and truth was slowly finding its way to Brenton. One evening, he returned from a short trip to Dallas and noticed something small. His mother's glasses were cracked, resting crookedly on the counter. When he asked what happened, Delaney brushed it off, said Nora had dropped them. But Nora avoided his eyes. He didn't push. He just watched. That weekend, during breakfast, he saw Delaney ignore his mother's attempt to join the table. He saw the way she looked at her like she was an inconvenience instead of family. He said nothing then either. But something in him started to shift. He realized he had built a house, but not a home. He remembered his mother once telling him, "It's easy to make a woman happy when life's easy, son. The truth shows when life slows down." He finally understood what she meant. And yet, despite the storm quietly brewing beneath their roof, Brenton stayed calm. Not because he didn't care, but because he wanted to be sure. He wanted the truth to come out on its own. As the narrator's tone softens, a quiet reflection rises. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that you refuse to see the cracks, then you already know how it feels to wake up inside a lie. If this moment reminds you of someone you loved enough to ignore the warning signs, don't scroll away. Subscribe, not for the story, but for every heart that's learned that wealth means nothing if your home is empty. Because soon, Brenton Alridge was about to learn, not through argument or confession, but through the most humiliating truth a man could ever witness. And when that truth finally arrived, it came with a bowl of dirty water. The following weeks at the Alridge estate settled into a strange rhythm, one that looked peaceful from the outside but was quietly eroding from within. Brenton spent more time on the road, managing field operations across Oklahoma and Texas. He often left before sunrise, returning days later when the house was quiet and the air inside felt heavier than before. Nora, meanwhile, spent most of her days in the sunroom, a quiet, glass-walled space overlooking the rolling countryside. She liked to sit there and watch the sparrows that gathered on the fence. It reminded her of simpler years when her son was still a boy. But Delaney saw that room differently. To her, it was an invasion, her mother-in-law's quiet claim over what used to be her space. Every morning, she walked past that room and felt irritation crawl beneath her skin. Nora's presence was constant. Her gentle, good mornings, her folded blankets, the way she left kind notes on the counter, all of it made Delaney feel overshadowed in her own home. She didn't hate Nora at first. But envy has a way of disguising itself as irritation until irritation turns cruel. By mid-September, that cruelty had started to show. It began in small, forgettable ways. Delaney would serve Nora cold breakfast while claiming she'd forgotten to reheat it. She would turn the thermostat low at night, knowing the older woman's joints ached in the cold. When Brenton called from his business trips, Delaney would put on her softest voice, telling him everything was fine, that Nora was resting, that she was taking care of her, like a daughter. In truth, her patience had long run out. One morning, while Nora tried to help fold laundry, Delaney snatched the clothes away, saying she was only getting in the way. When Nora accidentally spilled a cup of water, Delaney rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, not loud enough to be heard clearly, but sharp enough to wound. That was the rhythm of their days now, kindness laced with quiet cruelty. And through it all, Nora never complained. She told herself it wasn't worth upsetting her son. She convinced herself that Delaney was just stressed, that marriage made people restless, that Brenton would want peace more than pity. But even patience has limits. One afternoon, Nora overheard Delaney on the phone, a clipped conversation with someone from her social circle. Her voice dripped with disdain as she said, "I swear, it's like living with a housemaid. You'd think she'd be grateful to sit in a mansion she never earned." Those words cut deeper than any shout could. For the first time in her life, Nora cried quietly, not because she was weak, but because she realized she'd raised her son to love a woman who despised the very foundation he came from. That night, she almost called Brenton. But she stopped herself. Some truths, she thought, should be seen, not told. Meanwhile, Delaney was unraveling. Her friends from Tulsa's high society had started to pull away. Her smile in public felt forced, her laughter brittle. Behind every polite expression was resentment. Resentment that she had married into love instead of status, that she now shared her home with someone she saw as beneath her. To people like her, humility was humiliation. And Brenton's devotion to his mother was something she couldn't control or compete with. When Brenton mentioned taking Nora to her doctor's appointment, Delaney's tone turned icy. She offered to drive her there herself, pretending to be kind, but it was only to prove she could manage things alone. On the way, she accidentally took a longer route, kept the car air uncomfortably cold, and avoided conversation. Nora said nothing. She simply looked out the window at the flat Oklahoma landscape, brown fields stretching forever, and wondered how love could turn into this. A few days later, Brenton called to say he'd have to fly to Houston for a business meeting. It was supposed to last the week. Delaney smiled and told him to focus on work, that she'd take good care of his mother. He believed her. When his car pulled out of the driveway, Delaney exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. The house was hers again, silent, empty, free of witnesses. That freedom tasted sweet. The next morning, she didn't bring Nora breakfast. When Nora asked if she'd like help cleaning the kitchen, Delaney told her she could rest. But what she meant was stay out of my way. That afternoon, Delaney mopped the living room floors. The water was dark with dust from the week, a mix of detergent and filth. Nora, kind as always, came over and asked if she could take the bucket to empty it. Delaney's lips curled into a faint smirk, the kind that hides behind a polite smile. "No, I've got it," she said, though the kindness in her tone was gone. She lifted the bucket, walked toward the back door where Nora's chair sat, and paused. The old woman was resting, eyes half closed, her shawl slipping off her shoulders. For reasons even Delaney didn't understand, the urge to humiliate her pulsed like electricity. It wasn't rage. It was contempt, raw and unfiltered. She looked down at the bucket, then at Nora. And for one long, silent moment, the house held its breath. Outside, a car engine rumbled softly, a black SUV pulling up the driveway much earlier than expected. But inside, the sound didn't reach her. Delaney tilted the bucket just enough for the dirty water to spill, slow at first, then faster, splashing over the shawl and the chair, dripping onto the floor beneath Nora's feet. The old woman gasped, confused and frightened. The mop handle slipped from Delaney's hand, clattering against the tile. And just then, as if the universe demanded witness, the side door creaked open. Brenton Alridge stepped inside. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't told anyone he was coming home early. His meeting in Houston had been canceled, and he thought surprising his wife and mother would be a kind gesture. What he saw instead stopped him cold. The woman he once thought was the definition of grace now stood over his mother, a bucket in her hand, and not a trace of remorse in her face. The silence that filled the room was heavy, not just with shock, but with something darker, truth. He didn't speak. He didn't even move. He just watched. And that stillness, that quiet, would become the moment that changed everything. Delaney didn't see him standing there, not yet. But when she finally turned, and their eyes met across the wet tiles, something in the room shattered, and it wasn't just the piece. For a long moment, Brenton didn't move. He stood there by the doorway, a man frozen between disbelief and fury, watching the woman he thought he knew commit an act he couldn't have imagined in his worst dreams. The smell of detergent mixed with the sour scent of dirty water. Nora's shawl clung wet against her shoulders. The room was quiet except for the slow dripping from the mop bucket, one drop at a time hitting the tile like a ticking clock counting down to something irreversible. Delaney turned, startled. For the first time in years, her face broke, not into a practiced smile or a polite frown, but into something raw. Panic. She tried to speak, to rearrange her expression, to fix what couldn't be undone. But Brenton still didn't move. He looked at her with eyes that had seen 1,000 business betrayals, but never this, never something that cut this deep. In his silence, she began to tremble. Not out of guilt, but fear. Because in that silence, she saw something that no words could soften. Brenton finally walked forward. Not fast. Not angry. Just steady, like a man who'd stopped fighting the illusion. He knelt beside his mother, took the shawl from the chair, and placed it gently over her shoulders. Nora whispered his name, her voice small and shaking, but he only nodded, pressing her trembling hand. Then he looked at Delaney again, not as a husband, but as a man standing on the far edge of love. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask why. He simply stood up, took out his phone, and set it quietly on the table. There was a faint click, the sound of a camera app opening, and for the next few seconds, the phone recorded everything. Delaney didn't realize what he was doing. She was too busy trying to cover her own panic with denial. She muttered something about a misunderstanding, about slipping, about how Nora got in the way. Brenton just stood there. He let her talk. And as she tried to shape a story out of lies, his silence became heavier than shouting ever could be. Because sometimes, silence is the most powerful proof. When she finally ran out of words, he picked up the phone, slipped it back into his pocket, and turned to his mother. He told her softly to rest, that everything was fine now. Then he guided her to her room, helped her change into dry clothes, and made her tea. His movements were calm, but inside, something had fractured beyond repair. For Brenton, betrayal wasn't new. He'd seen it in boardrooms, in contracts rewritten behind his back, in competitors who smiled as they stole. But betrayal at home, that was different. That was sacred ground. And once it's broken, nothing feels safe again. He sat in his study after putting Nora to bed. The house was silent, the night pressing in. The footage on his phone glowed faintly on the screen, short, shaky, but undeniable. He didn't rewatch it. He didn't need to. The image was already burned into his memory. Delaney tried to knock on the door once, maybe twice, then stopped. She knew not to push him. She knew when silence turned from anger to something colder, calculation. Because Brenton Alridge wasn't the kind of man who reacted, he was the kind who planned. And if there was one thing she'd forgotten about her husband, it was that every move he made deliberately. The next morning, Brenton woke early, made breakfast for his mother, and left for work as usual. He kissed Nora's forehead and told her not to worry. Delaney waited, expecting confrontation, expecting shouting, lawyers, or at least a cold wall of avoidance. But none came. Instead, he acted as though nothing had happened. Days passed. The house returned to its strange rhythm. But Delaney could feel something shifting under the surface, like a storm that didn't make sound but changed the air before it broke. Brenton began taking calls in private. He called their family accountant, then their house staff, then, quietly, one of his public relations advisors. He wasn't angry anymore, he was focused. And that's always more dangerous than rage. He didn't tell his mother what he was planning. He didn't tell anyone. Because he didn't want pity, he wanted truth to speak for itself. A week later, he sent out invitations for a small dinner gathering at their home. Just family, close friends, a few business partners. He told Delaney it was to celebrate their anniversary early since he'd be traveling next month. She smiled, relieved, thinking maybe the worst had passed, that his silence was forgiveness. She couldn't have been more wrong. In the days leading up to the dinner, she tried to make amends with Nora, overcompensating, bringing her flowers, making small talk. But there was no warmth in it. It was performance. Even her apologies were rehearsed. Nora, wise as ever, played along. She said nothing to her son, nothing to Delaney. She just prayed that God would handle what her own heart couldn't. The night before the dinner, Brenton sat in the den with his phone again. He replayed the footage once more, not out of cruelty but clarity. He had to remind himself that this wasn't just anger. It was truth. The clip began, the sound of footsteps, the clatter of a bucket, his mother's startled gasp. And that look on Delaney's face. It wasn't regret. It was contempt. He paused the video midway and whispered to himself, let her words speak for her. He didn't plan to argue. He didn't plan to shame her in private. He planned to let her reveal herself in front of the same people she had fooled for years. Because sometimes the loudest justice isn't punishment, it's exposure. That night, as he stood in the doorway of his mother's room, Nora looked up and said softly, "You're quiet, Brenton." He smiled faintly and replied, "Just tired, Ma." But she knew. A mother always does. If you've ever had to hold back your anger to protect someone you love, you know that silence can be heavier than any scream. If this part of the story hits somewhere in your heart, subscribe not for the drama, but for the strength it takes to stay calm when the world expects you to break. The invitations were sent. The table was set. And the woman who poured dirty water on his mother had no idea that her own reflection was about to spill across the same floor she once defiled. Saturday arrived with a stillness that didn't feel peaceful, the kind that settles before a storm no one can see coming. The Alridge home looked perfect from the outside: manicured lawn, warm lights glowing through the front windows, a table set for celebration. To the neighbors, it looked like a family dinner. To Brenton, it was Judgment Day. Delaney spent the entire morning preparing. She had her hair styled, the table arranged with white roses and gold-trimmed plates, and the scent of rosemary chicken filled the house. It was the kind of evening she used to love, one where she could play the gracious hostess, where people would admire her and the life she'd built. But tonight, she wasn't calm. Something in Brenton's silence these past days had unsettled her. His politeness felt too measured, his eyes too steady. She told herself she was overthinking it, that the man she married wouldn't humiliate her no matter what he'd seen. He was too composed, too proud, too disciplined for that. By 7, the guests began to arrive. A handful of friends from Tulsa, 2 of Brenton's closest business partners, and his aunt and uncle from Norman. Nora sat quietly at the end of the table, wearing a soft gray shawl, the same one Delaney had drenched days before, freshly washed now, though its edges were still faintly stained. Brenton greeted everyone warmly. His composure was disarming. To anyone watching, he seemed like the same man he'd always been: charming, attentive, grounded. But behind his calm, every gesture was deliberate. Dinner began. Laughter rose and fell around the table. Glasses clinked. Delaney basked in the attention, her laughter slightly forced but still convincing. For a brief moment, she even believed she'd escaped it, that Brenton had chosen peace over punishment. Then, halfway through the meal, Brenton lifted his glass and stood. His tone was even, his expression unreadable. He thanked everyone for coming. He said a few words about family, about loyalty, about the way love reveals truth over time. Everyone smiled, nodding along, assuming it was a simple toast. Then, without warning, he picked up the small remote resting beside his plate and pressed a button. The room went still as the large TV across the dining room wall flickered to life. The sound came first, the soft splash of water, the clatter of a mop handle, and then the faint gasp of an elderly woman. Delaney froze. The footage wasn't long, only 20 seconds, but it didn't need to be. The camera's angle caught everything: her hand tipping the bucket, the dirty water pouring over Nora's shawl, and her face, unguarded, unkind. The guests turned toward her, disbelief written across every face. Even Nora couldn't breathe for a moment, her hand tightening on the edge of the table. Delaney's voice cracked as she tried to stand. She stammered something about editing, about misunderstanding, but her words tumbled out in chaos. She looked at her husband, pleading for rescue, but Brenton's expression didn't change. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just said quietly, "This is what respect looks like when love disappears." The silence after that felt eternal. One of the guests, Brenton's aunt, shook her head slowly, murmuring something about shame. Another rose to comfort Nora, who sat trembling, not from shock anymore but from the weight of vindication. Delaney's face flushed with panic. The walls of control she'd built over years were collapsing in front of everyone who once envied her. Her friends avoided her gaze. The room that had once been her stage was now her trial. Brenton stepped away from the table, leaving her there beneath the heavy gaze of truth. He didn't need to say anything more. Every second that passed spoke louder than words. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stared out through the window into the Oklahoma night. The fields stretched wide and silent, moonlight brushing over them like memory. Behind him, Delaney began to cry, not from remorse, but humiliation. She tried to follow him, reaching out, but he didn't turn. When she touched his arm, he moved away, not sharply, just enough to make it clear that she no longer had a place beside him. He said only one thing, voice low enough for her to barely hear. "You showed me who you were, Delaney. I just made sure you saw it too." And then he walked past her, past the guests, past the table that once symbolized unity but now stood as evidence of fracture. Nora watched him go, tears slipping down her face, not just from pain, but pride. Her son had protected her without losing his dignity. He had turned cruelty into justice without ever raising his voice. When the last guest left, the house fell silent again. Delaney sat alone at the table, staring at the reflection of the paused footage on the dark screen. Her perfect dinner lay untouched, growing cold. For the first time in her life, she felt what Nora must have felt that afternoon, small, powerless, and unseen. Brenton didn't sleep that night. He stayed in the study, the faint hum of the ceiling fan breaking the quiet. He wasn't angry anymore. Just hollow. Betrayal had a way of emptying a man, leaving behind a version of himself he barely recognized. He thought about divorce papers, about headlines, about the company's image. But more than that, he thought about his mother, the woman who never once spoke ill of anyone, even the one who hurt her most. He realized then that his revenge was already complete. Because the greatest punishment for someone like Delaney wasn't loss, it was exposure. She had spent her whole life curating admiration, and in one night, he'd taken that away forever. Still, as dawn crept over the fields, something in him stirred, not satisfaction, but exhaustion. Justice, he realized, doesn't always feel victorious. Sometimes it just feels necessary. And somewhere in the distance, a new sound filled the quiet, the low rumble of a car engine starting. Delaney was leaving before sunrise, a packed bag in her hand. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. Brenton stood by the window and watched her drive away, her taillights fading into the early Oklahoma fog. He didn't stop her. He didn't need to, because the truth had already done what words never could. But when he turned back toward his mother's room, expecting peace at last, the sound of her soft sobs stopped him in his tracks, and what she said next would change how he saw everything. Brenton stood outside his mother's door, his hand resting on the knob, the early light spilling across the hardwood floor. The house was quiet now, painfully so. Delaney's car was gone, the driveway empty except for her fading tire tracks. For the first time in months, there was peace. But it didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow. He opened the door softly. Nora was sitting upright in bed, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes red from crying. When she saw him, she tried to smile, but her lips trembled. He sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. He had imagined this moment, her comfort, her relief, her pride. But instead, there was sorrow. A quiet, lingering sorrow that didn't fit the victory he thought he'd earned. For a long time, neither spoke. The morning light flickered across the room, catching on the framed photographs of their family, his late father, a younger Nora, a much younger Brenton holding his first fishing pole on the river near Tahlequah. Life had once been so simple then. Finally, Nora whispered, "You shouldn't have done it that way." Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. Brenton frowned, confused. "You saw what she did, Ma. You know what she—" Nora shook her head gently. "I know what she did. But you didn't do it for me. You did it for yourself." Her words landed like a quiet storm. He wanted to deny it, to insist he'd been protecting her. But deep down, he knew she was right. He had exposed Delaney not just to defend his mother, but to punish the wound she'd left in his pride, the betrayal that had made him feel powerless. His silence hadn't been mercy, it had been vengeance dressed as control. Nora reached for his hand, her fingers thin and trembling. "Brenton," she said softly, "you don't fix cruelty by becoming colder than it." He looked down, the shame creeping in, a heavy, slow realization that all his restraint, his planning, his calmness had come from anger he didn't want to admit. She went on, her tone as steady as her frail hands. "Do you know why I stayed quiet all this time? Why I never told you what she said, what she did?" He didn't answer. "Because I saw something in her that reminded me of your father's family," she continued. "That same pride, that same hunger to be seen. And I knew, if I told you, you'd destroy her. You'd lose the softness I raised you with. I wanted you to stay good, even if the world around you wasn't." He felt his throat tighten. 4 years, Nora had been the quiet anchor of his life, steady, patient, forgiving. And now, even after everything Delaney had done, she was still finding grace in the wreckage. But then her voice broke, not with calm, but with grief. "I failed her, Brenton. Maybe if I'd tried harder to love her, she wouldn't have turned out this way. Maybe if I hadn't made her feel like a guest in her own home, she wouldn't have tried to make me feel small. That sentence silenced him. It was true, even if unintentionally, Nora had lived as the quiet authority in that house. Every gesture, every habit, every presence reminded Delaney she'd married into something, not built it. And for a woman who needed control, that feeling was unbearable. Brenton had never seen it that way. He looked at his mother, tears welling, and realized that in his quest to punish his wife, he hadn't once tried to understand her brokenness. It didn't excuse her cruelty, but it explained it. And that, he knew, was the difference between justice and grace. He squeezed his mother's hand. "I just wanted to make things right," he whispered. Nora smiled faintly. "Then start by forgiving what you can. Not for her, for you." They sat in silence after that. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the Oklahoma hills. The same land that had seen their family rise, break, and rebuild. Later that week, Delaney's attorney called. She hadn't asked for money, property, or compensation. She'd signed the papers quietly, asking only for her things to be sent to a storage unit in Tulsa. It was over. But Brenton didn't feel triumphant. He felt older, like something had ended in him too. Over the next few months, life settled into a slower rhythm. He sold one of his companies, spent more time with his mother, and started visiting a community center in Muskogee, not to donate, but to volunteer quietly on weekends, helping small business owners navigate the world he once ruled from a distance. He stopped chasing control. He started seeking peace. And though he never spoke to Delaney again, he thought about her often, not with anger, but with a kind of distant sorrow. Because sometimes, he realized, love doesn't end because people stop caring. It ends because one person forgets how to be kind. That was the real tragedy. Months later, when Nora passed peacefully in her sleep, Brenton found an envelope tucked inside her Bible. On the front, in her delicate handwriting, were the words, "For my son, when forgiveness feels too hard." Inside was a note that read, "Remember, Brenton, people show their pain in strange ways. Don't carry it with you. Let it pass through you, and you'll still have room for love." He folded the note carefully and placed it inside his wallet, where it stayed for the rest of his life. In the end, Brenton Alridge didn't rebuild his marriage or chase new wealth. He rebuilt something rare, peace. And that, more than any revenge, was his quiet victory. Some stories don't end with punishment. They end with lessons that hurt and heal at the same time. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you that love without respect will always collapse, then subscribe. Not for entertainment, but because deep down, stories like this remind us what still matters in a world that often forgets.